During my husband's will reading, my daughter said, "You can leave now, Mom. This is between me and my mother-in-law." When she read the will, she was shocked to see her name in the clause. The reading of the will made her faint. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Sherry, and at 68 years old, I never imagined my own daughter would look me in the eye and tell me I didn't belong at my husband's will reading. You can leave now, Mom. This is between me and my mother-in-law." Elodie's voice cut through the mahogany-paneled law office like a blade. I sat there, clutching my worn purse, feeling my heart sink into my stomach. After 43 years of marriage to Robert, after holding his hand through his final breath just 2 weeks ago, my own daughter was dismissing me like I was some stranger who'd wandered into the wrong room. The lawyer, Mr. Henderson, shifted uncomfortably behind his massive desk. "Mrs. Patterson, perhaps we should proceed with all family members present." "She's not immediate family in this matter," Elodie interrupted, not even looking at me. She sat there in her expensive black suit, the one I knew cost more than my monthly Social Security check, her perfectly manicured nails drumming against the leather chair. "The estate planning concerns the primary beneficiaries." Nellie, Robert's mother and Elodie's mother-in-law, nodded approvingly from her seat. At 74, she still carried herself with the same cold authority that had made my life miserable for decades. "Sherry, dear, perhaps you'd be more comfortable waiting in the lobby. This is really a formality anyway." The way she said "dear" made my skin crawl. It was the same tone she'd used when she told me my casserole wasn't quite right for Robert's taste, or when she suggested I might want to freshen up before family photos. Everything wrapped in false sweetness but designed to cut deep. I wanted to stand up for myself. I wanted to remind them that I'd been the one changing Robert's bedsheets when he was too weak to get to the bathroom. I'd been the one sleeping in that uncomfortable hospital chair for 3 months, while Elodie made excuses about being too busy with her social commitments. But the words stuck in my throat like they always did. "I think I have a right to be here," I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. Elodie finally turned to look at me, and the expression on her face made me feel smaller than I'd ever felt in my life. It wasn't anger. It was pure disgust, like she was looking at something that had crawled out from under a rock. "Right," she laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Mom, you've been living off Dad for decades. You never worked, never contributed anything meaningful to this family's success. Did you really think you'd inherit anything significant?" Each word hit me like a physical blow. I thought about all those years I'd given up my teaching career to take care of her when she was small, all the dreams I'd put aside to support Robert's business ventures. But how do you explain a lifetime of sacrifice to someone who sees it as laziness? Nellie leaned forward with that practiced smile of hers. Now, Elodie, your mother deserves something, of course. I'm sure Robert left her enough to maintain a modest lifestyle. Modest lifestyle. The phrase hung in the air like a judgment. I looked down at my hands, noticing how thin and pale they'd become. When had I gotten so old? When had I become so invisible? Mr. Henderson cleared his throat again. "I really must insist that Mrs. Patterson remain for the reading. There are specific provisions." "What provisions?" Elodie snapped. "Dad and I discussed everything extensively during his illness. He understood that I'm the one who'll be taking care of Nellie as she ages, managing the properties, handling the investments. I'm the responsible one." The responsible one? I almost laughed at that. Elodie, who hadn't visited her father in the hospital until the last week when she realized he was actually dying. Elodie, who'd spent the past 6 months asking pointed questions about life insurance policies and property values, while I begged her to just spend time with him. But I said nothing. I just sat there, feeling the familiar weight of disappointment settle over me like a heavy blanket. This was my life, being talked about like I wasn't in the room. Having my worth measured and found wanting by the very people I'd sacrificed everything for. "Fine," I said quietly, standing up on unsteady legs. "I'll wait outside." As I reached for the door handle, I heard Elodie whisper to Nellie, "She'll be fine. Mom's always been dramatic about money. This will probably be good for her. Teach her some independence." I paused with my hand on the door, feeling something crack inside my chest. Not my heart. That had been breaking slowly for years. Something deeper. Something that had been holding me together finally gave way. I stepped into the hallway and sank into one of the uncomfortable waiting room chairs. Through the thick glass door, I could see them settling in for what they clearly expected to be a celebration. Elodie was already pulling out her phone, probably texting her friends about her inheritance. Nellie was adjusting her pearls, preparing to hear how wealthy she was about to become. Neither of them had any idea what Robert had really thought about their behavior these past few months. Neither of them knew about the conversations we'd had in those long hospital nights, when he'd watched Elodie breeze in for 5-minute visits before rushing off to her next social engagement. What they definitely didn't know was what I'd been hiding from all of them for the past 8 months, the reason I'd been so tired, so thin, so desperately in need of the family support that never came. Sitting in that sterile waiting room, I couldn't stop my mind from drifting back to when this nightmare really began. It was 6 months ago, when Robert first got the diagnosis that would eventually take his life. I remember walking into our living room that Thursday afternoon, finding Elodie and Nellie huddled together on the couch, their voices dropping to whispers the moment they saw me. They'd been doing that a lot lately, having these private conversations that stopped whenever I entered a room. "Oh, Sherry," Nellie had said with that false brightness she'd perfected over the years. "We were just discussing Robert's medical care. You know how overwhelming these decisions can be." Overwhelming. As if I hadn't been the one taking him to every doctor's appointment, organizing his medications, sleeping on the hospital floor when he was too scared to be alone. But I'd nodded and smiled, grateful they were finally showing some interest in helping. How naive I'd been. "Mom," Elodie had said, not quite meeting my eyes, "Nellie and I think it might be better if we take over coordinating Dad's care. You're getting older, and this is a lot of stress. We don't want you making yourself sick." Making myself sick. The irony of those words still burned. If only they'd known how sick I already was, how I'd been scheduling my own doctor appointments around Robert's chemo sessions, how I'd been hiding my own test results in a shoebox under our bed because I couldn't bear to add one more burden to his shoulders. "I can handle it," I'd protested weakly. "I've been taking care of him just fine." Nellie had reached over and patted my hand with those cold, perfectly manicured fingers. "Of course you have, dear. But Elodie has experience with medical management from her volunteer work, and I have connections with the best specialists in the city. We just want what's best for Robert. What's best for Robert." It sounded so reasonable, so caring. But I saw the look that passed between them. Satisfaction, like chess players who'd just executed a winning strategy. That's when the isolation really began. Suddenly, I wasn't included in conversations with the doctors. Elodie would schedule appointments and forget to tell me until afterward. When I'd ask questions about treatment options, they'd exchange those looks again and tell me not to worry about the complicated medical stuff. "Dad's in good hands," Elodie would say whenever I tried to assert myself. "You should focus on resting. You look exhausted all the time lately." I was exhausted, but not just from caring for Robert, from the constant battle to remain relevant in my own husband's medical care. From pretending I didn't notice how they'd steer him away whenever he tried to include me in discussions. From acting like it didn't hurt when they'd suggest I take a little break every time I tried to attend a family meeting. The worst part was watching how they manipulated Robert when he was at his weakest. I'd come back from making tea to find them sitting close to his bedside, their voices low and serious. "You need to think about Sherry's future," I'd overheard Nellie saying one afternoon. "She's never been good with finances. If something happens to you, she'll need guidance. Professional management. Professional management." As if I were a child who couldn't be trusted with money. "Elodie's so smart about these things," she'd continued, "and she understands the family assets. She could make sure Sherry is taken care of properly. Taken care of. Not respected, not trusted, taken care of. Like a pet that needed feeding." Robert had been so weak then, so confused from the medications. I watched him nod along, not really understanding what they were suggesting, just grateful that his daughter seemed to be taking an interest in family responsibilities for once. But I understood. I understood that they were systematically erasing me from my own life, painting me as incompetent and fragile while positioning themselves as the responsible caretakers. They were building a narrative that would justify whatever they had planned. The most painful memory was from just 3 weeks before Robert died. I'd been in the kitchen, trying to prepare his favorite soup, when I'd heard Elodie on the phone in the next room. "No, she's not adjusting well to Dad's illness at all," she'd been saying. "She's becoming increasingly unreliable. Yesterday, she couldn't even remember which medications he'd taken. Honestly, I'm worried about her mental state." I'd dropped the ladle, feeling my hands shake. Not from weakness, from rage, because that was a lie. I remembered every single medication, every dosage, every side effect. I'd been the one managing his care while she showed up for photo opportunities. But when I'd confronted her about it later, she'd looked at me with such pitying concern. "Mom, you're getting confused again. I never said that. Maybe you should consider seeing someone about these memory issues." Memory issues. She was gaslighting me, making me question my own reality while she systematically took control of everything that mattered to me. The final piece of their strategy became clear during Robert's last week. I'd wanted to stay with him around the clock, but suddenly there were too many visitors, and visiting hour restrictions that somehow never seemed to apply to Elodie and Nellie. "The nurses said he needs quiet," Elodie had explained when I found them both sitting beside his bed during the time I was supposedly not allowed to visit. "We're just keeping him company so he's not alone." They'd stolen even that from me. The chance to hold my husband's hand as he died, to be the last voice he heard. By the time they called to tell me he was gone, it was over. 43 years of marriage, and I wasn't even there at the end. Now, sitting outside that lawyer's office, I realized their plan was reaching its conclusion. They'd spent months undermining my credibility, questioning my competence, positioning themselves as the responsible parties who would need to manage whatever Robert left behind. What they didn't know was that Robert had been more aware than they'd realized. Much more aware. I'd been sitting in that waiting room for nearly an hour when I heard the first scream. It came from behind the heavy oak door of Mr. Henderson's office, a sharp, disbelieving cry that made my blood run cold. Then came the sound of papers rustling frantically, chairs scraping against the floor, and Elodie's voice rising to a pitch I'd never heard before. "This can't be right. There has to be some mistake." I pressed closer to the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. Through the frosted glass, I could see shadowy figures moving frantically around the desk. "I assure you, Mrs. Patterson, there is no mistake," came Mr. Henderson's calm, professional voice. "Your father was very specific about these provisions. He spent considerable time ensuring the language was precisely what he intended." "Read it again!" That was Nellie's voice, sharp and commanding. "There must be some codicil, some additional document we haven't seen yet." The silence that followed was thick with tension. I found myself holding my breath, straining to hear every word. "Very well," Mr. Henderson said, and I could hear the rustling of papers. "Regarding my daughter, Elodie Marie Patterson, I have observed with growing concern her treatment of her mother during my final illness. Her neglect of Sherry's well-being, her dismissive attitude toward her mother's needs, and her obvious preoccupation with financial inheritance rather than family compassion have demonstrated a character unsuited to the responsibility of wealth." My hand flew to my mouth. Robert had been watching. He'd seen everything. Mr. Henderson continued reading, his voice steady and clinical. "Furthermore, her collaboration with my mother, Nellie Patterson, to systematically exclude Sherry from medical decisions and family discussions represents a cruelty I cannot and will not reward. Therefore, I leave to Elodie the sum of $5,000, to be held in trust until she can demonstrate 1 full year of consistent, respectful care toward her mother." $5,000? Elodie's voice cracked. "5,000? I'm his daughter. I'm his only child." "There's more," Mr. Henderson said quietly. "To my mother, Nellie Patterson, who encouraged and participated in the emotional abandonment of my wife during the most difficult period of our lives, I leave the sum of $1,000 and suggest she examine her conscience regarding the treatment of the woman who cared for her son with unwavering devotion." I heard something crash, probably a glass being thrown or knocked over. Then Nellie's voice, colder than I'd ever heard it. "This is that woman's doing. She manipulated him when he was weak, confused from the medications. We'll contest this. No court will uphold such an obviously coerced document. Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Henderson said, and I could hear the disapproval in his tone. Your son was of completely sound mind when he executed this will. In fact, he specifically anticipated challenges to his mental capacity. He included extensive documentation of his reasoning, including detailed notes about incidents he observed and conversations he overheard. What incidents? Elodie demanded. What conversations? The rustling of papers again. He documented the afternoon you told him that your mother was becoming increasingly unreliable and suggested she might have memory issues. He noted that this conversation took place while Mrs. Patterson was in the kitchen, preparing his medication with perfect accuracy, as she had done every day for months. My knees went weak. Robert had heard that phone call. He'd known Elodie was lying about me. He also documented the evening you and Mrs. Nellie Patterson discussed having your mother declared incompetent to manage finances, despite her having successfully managed the household budget for over 4 decades. This conversation took place while Mrs. Patterson was bathing your father, something she did twice daily without assistance. We never said anything about having her declared incompetent, Elodie protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Your father's notes suggest otherwise. He quotes you as saying, "We need to make sure Mom doesn't have access to any significant amounts. She's not equipped to handle real money, and honestly, she's showing signs of decline." The silence that followed was deafening. I remembered that night. I'd been helping Robert with his bath, and I'd heard their voices from the living room, but I'd been so focused on keeping him comfortable that I hadn't really processed what they were saying. Robert had, though. Robert had heard every word. So where? Elodie's voice was barely a whisper now. Where does everything go? The house? The investment accounts? The life insurance policies? The vacation property? Everything goes to Mrs. Sherry Patterson, with the provision that she use these assets to ensure her own health and well-being for the remainder of her life. I felt the world tilt sideways. Everything? Robert had left me everything? He can't do this! Nellie's voice was shrill now, desperate. I'm his mother. I raised him. Everything I did was to protect the family assets. From whom? Mr. Henderson's question hung in the air like a challenge. From his wife of 43 years? The woman who sacrificed her career to raise his child and support his business ventures? The woman who spent 3 months sleeping in a hospital chair because she couldn't bear to leave his side? She's manipulative, Elodie shouted. She's always been good at playing the victim. Dad was vulnerable, scared. She took advantage of that. Your father anticipated this reaction as well, Mr. Henderson said calmly. He included a personal letter to be read aloud in the event that his decisions were questioned. More paper rustling. Then Mr. Henderson's voice, softer now, reading words that made my heart ache. To my daughter Elodie, if you are hearing this letter, it means you have challenged my final wishes. I want you to know that every decision I made was the result of months of careful observation, not medication-induced confusion or manipulation. The letter continued, and I pressed even closer to the door. You spent my final months asking about money while your mother asked about my pain levels. You visited to discuss inheritance while she read to me for hours when I couldn't sleep. You saw my illness as an inconvenience that interrupted your social life while she saw it as our final chapter together, something to be cherished despite the difficulty. I heard what sounded like sobbing. Whether from Elodie or Nellie, I couldn't tell. Most importantly, you treated your mother like a burden when she was the greatest blessing of my life. You dismissed her concerns, ignored her needs, and spoke about her as if she were already dead. I cannot trust my life's work to someone who would treat the woman I love with such casual cruelty. There was a long pause before Mr. Henderson continued. The assets I leave to Sherry are not a reward for manipulation. They are compensation for devotion. She has earned every dollar through 43 years of putting my needs, your needs, and this family's needs before her own. It is time someone put her needs first. The door suddenly flew open, and Elodie stumbled out, her face red and streaked with tears. She looked at me sitting there, and for a moment, I saw something flicker across her features. Shame, maybe, or recognition, but it was quickly replaced by rage. This isn't over, she hissed. I don't know how you did this, but this isn't over. Behind her, Nellie appeared. Her composed mask finally cracked. She looked older, smaller, defeated. 43 years, she muttered, more to herself than to me. He chose you after 43 years. They walked past me without another word, leaving me alone with the echo of Robert's final gift. Not just the money, but the validation I'd needed for so long. He had seen me. He had known. After Elodie and Nellie stormed out, Mr. Henderson invited me back into his office. I sat in the same chair where my daughter had just learned that her father had seen through her games, and I tried to process the magnitude of what had just happened. "Mrs. Patterson," Mr. Henderson said gently, "your husband left specific instructions for me to discuss your financial situation privately. He was concerned about your health circumstances." My stomach dropped. "He knew?" Mr. Henderson nodded, his expression kind but serious. "He found your medical files 3 weeks before he passed, the ones you'd hidden in the shoebox under your bed." I felt tears spring to my eyes. Of course Robert had found them. He'd probably been looking for something else entirely and stumbled across my secret shame, the diagnosis I'd been carrying alone for 8 months. "He was devastated that you'd felt the need to hide your condition from him," Mr. Henderson continued. "But he understood why you did it. He said you'd always been the one taking care of everyone else, never wanting to burden anyone with your own problems. Stage 2, breast cancer. That's what Dr. Martinez had told me on that terrible March afternoon, while Robert was recovering from his first round of chemotherapy. The timing couldn't have been worse. How could I tell my dying husband that his wife was also fighting for her life? So I'd hidden it. I'd scheduled my own appointments around his medical needs. I'd suffered through the exhaustion, the pain, the fear, all while maintaining the facade that I was strong enough to take care of him. It had been the hardest 8 months of my life. "He left detailed instructions about your treatment," Mr. Henderson said, sliding a folder across the desk. "He researched the best oncologists in the country, the top treatment facilities. He wanted to ensure you had every possible resource to fight this." I opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were appointment cards for specialists at prestigious cancer centers, contact information for experimental treatment programs, and a detailed financial plan that would cover any medical expense I might need. "But how did he know about all this?" I whispered. "He was so sick himself. He spent his final weeks making calls, researching options. Your husband was determined to ensure you had the chance he was being denied." Mr. Henderson paused, choosing his words carefully. "He also documented your daughter's response when he tried to discuss your health with her." My blood went cold. "What do you mean?" Mr. Henderson pulled out another set of papers, Robert's handwritten notes, shakier than his usual neat script but still legible. "He wrote this 3 days before he died. May I read it to you?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. I tried to talk to Elodie about Sherry's health concerns today. I mentioned that her mother had seemed unusually tired lately, that she'd lost weight, that I was worried she might be making herself sick, caring for me. Elodie's response was shocking. She said, "Dad, Mom's always been dramatic about health issues. She probably just wants attention now that you're getting all the medical focus. Don't let her guilt you into worrying about her fake problems when you need to concentrate on getting better." Each word hit me like a physical blow. I remembered that conversation. Robert had asked me gently if I was feeling okay, if I needed to see a doctor. I'd brushed off his concerns, not wanting to worry him. I'd had no idea he'd already tried to enlist Elodie's help in convincing me to seek medical attention. Mr. Henderson continued reading. "When I pressed her about being more supportive of her mother during this difficult time, Elodie said, 'Dad, you're the one who's dying. Mom can deal with whatever's bothering her after we get through this. Her problems aren't life-threatening like yours are.' If only she'd known how wrong she was." "He tried one more time," Mr. Henderson said, flipping to another page. "This was 2 days before he passed. He'd grown weaker, but he was still worried about you." The final note was barely legible, written in Robert's deteriorating handwriting. "Asked Elodie to promise she'd take care of her mother after I'm gone. She said, 'Of course, Dad, but Mom's tougher than she looks. She'll be fine on her own. She always lands on her feet.' I realized then that my daughter has no idea who her mother really is. She sees strength where there should be support, independence where there should be interdependence. She's mistaken Sherry's selflessness for self-sufficiency. I cannot trust my wife's future to someone who fundamentally misunderstands her needs. I was crying openly now, mourning not just for Robert, but for the daughter who had become a stranger to me. When had Elodie started seeing my sacrifices as manipulation, my needs as weaknesses? Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Henderson said softly, your husband's final wish was that you use this inheritance to save your own life. He said he'd spent 43 years watching you put everyone else first, and he wanted his death to mark the beginning of you finally putting yourself first. A knock at the door interrupted us. Mr. Henderson frowned. He'd asked his secretary to hold all calls and visitors. But the knock came again, more insistent this time. Come in, he called reluctantly. The door opened and Elodie stepped back into the office. Her face was blotchy from crying, her perfect makeup ruined. Behind her stood Nellie, looking more disheveled than I'd ever seen her. We need to talk, Elodie said, her voice hoarse. All of us, about what happens next. Mr. Henderson started to object, but I held up my hand. It's okay, I said quietly. Let them say what they came to say. Elodie looked at me for a long moment, then at the medical files spread across the desk. Her eyes widened as she took in the cancer center letterheads, the oncology appointment schedules. Mom, she whispered, what is all this? I took a deep breath, feeling exhaustion settle into my bones. It was time to stop protecting everyone else from the truth. I have cancer, Elodie. I've had it for 8 months. Stage 2 breast cancer, and it's been spreading while I've been taking care of your father and pretending everything was fine. The color drained from her face. 8 months? But why didn't you tell us? I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the cruel, greedy woman who'd dismissed me from the will reading, but the frightened child she'd once been. The little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. Because, I said simply, every time I tried to mention that I wasn't feeling well, you told me I was being dramatic. Every time I suggested I might need to see a doctor, you said I was trying to steal attention from your father, so I stopped trying. Nellie sank into the chair beside Elodie, looking suddenly ancient. Oh, Sherry, she breathed. We had no idea. No, I agreed. You had no idea, because you never asked. You never looked. You were so busy planning your inheritance that you forgot to see the person who was dying right in front of you. The room fell silent except for the ticking of Mr. Henderson's antique clock. Finally, Elodie spoke, her voice barely audible. What can we do? How can we help? Please tell us how to fix this. I looked at my daughter, at the desperation in her eyes, and felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But maybe the beginning of hope that the woman who'd raised her with so much love was still somewhere inside the stranger she'd become. 6 weeks after that devastating day in the lawyer's office, I stood on the balcony of my new apartment in Monterey, California, watching the sun set over the Pacific Ocean. The salty breeze carried away the last of my old life, the one where I'd made myself small to accommodate everyone else's needs. The apartment was nothing like the house I'd shared with Robert. It was smaller, simpler, but it was entirely mine. Every piece of furniture, every picture on the wall, every book on the shelf reflected my choices, not what would look impressive to visitors or what would match someone else's idea of good taste. My first oncology appointment at the Monterey Bay Cancer Center had been 2 weeks ago. Dr. Sarah Chen, one of the top breast cancer specialists in the country, had reviewed my files with the kind of focused attention I'd forgotten I deserved. Mrs. Patterson, she'd said, her voice both gentle and direct, I'm concerned about the delay in treatment, but I'm optimistic about your prognosis. We caught this at stage 2, and with aggressive treatment, your chances of full recovery are excellent. Aggressive treatment. The phrase that had terrified me when I was trying to care for Robert, while hiding my own illness, now sounded like hope. I had the best doctors, unlimited resources, and most importantly, the mental energy to focus on getting well instead of taking care of everyone else. The chemotherapy had started immediately. Unlike Robert's treatments, which I'd watched destroy him slowly, mine felt different. Maybe it was because I was catching it earlier. Or maybe it was because I finally had permission to put my health first. Either way, I was responding well. My phone buzzed on the small patio table beside me. Elodie's name appeared on the screen. The 4th call this week. I'd been answering about half of them, which was more than I'd managed in the first few weeks after leaving Sacramento. "Hi, Mom." Her voice was softer than I'd heard it in years, lacking the impatient edge that had become so familiar. "Hello, Elodie. How are you feeling today? Did you have treatment this week?" These were new questions from her. For months after the will reading, our conversations had consisted entirely of apologies and promises to do better. But gradually, she'd started asking about my actual day-to-day life, my health, my small pleasures. "I had treatment on Tuesday," I told her. "Dr. Chen says the tumors are shrinking faster than expected." I heard her breath catch with relief. "That's wonderful. I'm so happy to hear that." There was a pause, and I knew what was coming next. She'd been building up to the same request for weeks now. "Mom, I was wondering if maybe I could come visit you next weekend. I know you said you needed space, but I thought maybe we could have dinner, just the two of us. I could cook for you this time." The old me would have said yes immediately, would have prioritized her needs over my own boundaries. But the woman I was becoming, the one Robert had wanted me to be, took time to consider what I actually wanted. "I'm not ready for overnight visits yet," I said finally. "But if you want to come down for the day on Saturday, we could have lunch." "Yes," she said quickly. "Yes, I'd love that. Should I bring anything? Groceries? I could stop at that farmer's market you mentioned." It was strange, hearing her offer to take care of me instead of the other way around. Part of me wanted to tell her not to bother, that I was perfectly capable of shopping for myself, but I recognized that impulse as the old pattern, pushing away help because I'd been trained to believe I didn't deserve it. "Actually," I said, "there's a little Italian place here that makes fresh pasta. We could go there instead. It overlooks the harbor." "That sounds perfect. Mom, I've been going to therapy. Dr. Rodriguez is helping me understand how I treated you, why I became so focused on material things instead of relationships." I'd wondered about that. The Elodie who called me now was different from the one who'd tried to exile me from the will reading. More thoughtful, more aware of her impact on others. "How's that going?" I asked. "It's hard," she admitted, realizing that I became exactly like Nellie, that I treated you the way she always treated you. "Dr. Rodriguez says I learned to see love as something you had to earn through achievement rather than something you deserved just for existing." That analysis hit closer to home than I wanted to admit. I'd spent my entire adult life trying to earn love through service, through sacrifice, through making myself indispensable. Maybe Elodie had learned that pattern from watching me. "What about Nellie?" I asked. "How is she handling everything?" Elodie was quiet for a moment. "She's struggling. She moved to that senior community in Roseville, the one with assisted living services. She keeps asking if I think you'll ever forgive her, if there's anything she can do to make amends." I looked out at the ocean, watching a pelican dive for fish in the waves below. A year ago, I would have felt guilty about Nellie's situation, would have worried that I was being too harsh. Now I felt something closer to indifference. "I don't wish her harm," I said finally, "but I don't have the energy to manage her guilt along with my own healing. I understand. And Mom, I need you to know that I don't expect forgiveness. I know I have to earn back your trust, and I know it might take years. Maybe it might never happen completely, but I want to try." After we hung up, I sat on my balcony until the stars came out, thinking about the strange turns life takes. A year ago, I'd been invisible in my own family, dying slowly from neglect and undiagnosed cancer. Now I was the one with all the power, all the resources, all the choices. The irony wasn't lost on me that it had taken Robert's death to give me life. My phone buzzed again. A text this time, from Dr. Chen's office confirming my appointment for next week. Routine follow-up, checking my progress. The treatments were working so well that we might be able to reduce the frequency soon. I thought about calling someone to share the good news, then realized I didn't need to. This joy was mine to hold, mine to savor, without diluting it by managing someone else's reaction to it. Tomorrow I had plans to visit the local botanical garden, something I'd never had time for when I was busy taking care of everyone else. Next week, I was starting a watercolor painting class at the community center, Small pleasures, but they felt revolutionary after a lifetime of putting everyone else's interests first. The ocean breeze picked up, carrying the sound of sea lions barking on the distant rocks. I pulled my sweater closer around my shoulders and smiled. For the first time in decades, I was exactly where I wanted to be, doing exactly what I wanted to do. And if that meant some people had to learn to live without my constant caretaking, well, maybe that was a lesson they'd needed to learn all along. 18 months later, I stood in front of the mirror in my bedroom, adjusting the soft blue scarf I'd chosen to wear instead of a wig. My hair was growing back, silver and curly in a way it had never been before, and I'd decided I liked it better than the mousy brown I'd maintained for decades. The woman looking back at me bore little resemblance to the exhausted, invisible person who'd been dismissed from that law office over a year ago. My eyes were brighter, my shoulders straighter. I'd gained back the weight I'd lost during those terrible months of hiding my illness, and my skin had the healthy glow that comes from being truly, deeply happy. Today was a special day. Dr. Chen had called yesterday with the results of my latest scans. No evidence of disease, complete remission. After 18 months of treatment, countless appointments, and more strength than I'd known I possessed, I was officially cancer-free. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. Through the window, I could see Elodie standing on my front porch, holding a bouquet of sunflowers, my favorite, though she'd only learned that in the past year. "Hi, Mom," she said when I opened the door, and I noticed she looked nervous. Our monthly visits had become easier over time, but there was still a formality to them, a careful politeness that spoke to how much work we still had to do. "Come in," I said, accepting the flowers. "These are beautiful. Let me put them in water." As I arranged the sunflowers in a vase, Elodie wandered around my living room, taking in the changes I'd made since her last visit. New books on the shelves, a half-finished watercolor painting on the easel by the window, photos from my recent trip to the botanical gardens in San Francisco. "You redecorated," she observed. "I bought new things that I actually like instead of things that looked appropriate," I corrected gently. "There's a difference." She smiled at that, a real smile that reminded me of the little girl she'd once been. "Dr. Rodriguez says that's part of recovery, learning to trust your own preferences instead of performing for other people's approval." Elodie had been in therapy for over a year now, working through what her therapist called inherited patterns of conditional love. It was slow work, unlearning a lifetime of believing that affection had to be earned through achievement and compliance. "How is therapy going?" I asked, settling into my favorite chair, a comfortable reading chair I'd bought simply because I liked the way it felt. Not because it matched anything else in the room. Better. Harder some days than others. Elodie sat across from me, her hands folded in her lap. "Dr. Rodriguez has been helping me understand how I learned to see you as weak instead of selfless, how I mistook your sacrifices for choices." This was territory we'd covered before in our careful conversations. Elodie was working to understand how she'd become someone who could dismiss her own mother so cruelly, while I was learning to set boundaries that protected my newly discovered sense of self-worth. "I have something to tell you," I said, deciding it was time to share my news. "Dr. Chen called yesterday. The cancer is gone. Completely gone." Elodie's face lit up with genuine joy, and for a moment she looked like she might cry. "Oh, Mom, that's incredible. I'm so happy for you. Thank you. It feels surreal, honestly. After everything that's happened, I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop." "But it won't," Elodie said firmly. "You're healthy. You're free. You're living the life you want. You deserve all of this." It was such a simple statement, but it meant everything coming from her. For most of my life, I'd believed I deserved very little. Certainly not the comfortable life Robert's inheritance had provided, not the excellent medical care that had saved my life, not the peaceful independence I'd found in this small coastal town. "There's something else I wanted to discuss with you," Elodie said, her voice becoming more serious. "About Nellie." My stomach tightened slightly. Nellie was still a complicated subject between us. She'd been calling Elodie regularly, asking for updates about my health, wondering if I might be ready to consider reconciliation. She's not doing well, Elodie continued. The assisted living place is nice, but she's very isolated. She doesn't have many friends there, and she spends most of her time thinking about how she treated you during Dad's illness. I waited, knowing there was more. She asked me to give you this. Elodie pulled an envelope from her purse, my name written on it in Nellie's distinctive handwriting. She's not asking for forgiveness or trying to manipulate you into contact. She just wanted you to know how sorry she is. I took the envelope but didn't open it immediately. How do you feel about her situation? Honestly, I feel bad for her, but I also understand why you can't have her in your life. She spent decades treating you poorly, and her being lonely now doesn't erase that history. It was a mature response, one that showed how much Elodie had grown. The old Elodie would have pushed for reconciliation, would have tried to manage everyone's emotions to avoid conflict. I might read her letter eventually, I said, setting it aside, but not today. Today is for celebrating. Elodie nodded, understanding. What would you like to do to celebrate? I thought about it. A year ago, I would have suggested something that centered on her preferences, something that would make her happy, but I was learning to prioritize my own joy. I want to walk on the beach, I said. I want to feel the sand between my toes and watch the waves, and then I want to come back here and order too much Chinese food and watch an old movie. That sounds perfect, Elodie said, and I could tell she meant it. We spent the afternoon walking along the shoreline, talking about small things, my painting class, her work, the novel I was reading. Nothing heavy or emotionally charged, just the comfortable conversation of two people who were learning to know each other again. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I realized how different this moment was from anything I'd experienced in my previous life. I wasn't worrying about anyone else's needs or managing anyone else's emotions. I was simply present, enjoying the company of my daughter without the weight of obligation or resentment. Mom, Elodie said as we turned to head back to the house, I know I can't undo the past, but I want you to know how proud I am of you. The way you've rebuilt your life, the strength you've shown, it's incredible. I stopped walking and looked at her. This woman who had once been my greatest heartbreak and was slowly becoming something like a friend. Thank you, I said simply. That means more than you know. Later that evening, after Elodie had driven back to Sacramento and I was alone with my Chinese takeout and an old Katharine Hepburn movie, I opened Nellie's letter. It was shorter than I'd expected, written in her careful script. Dear Sherry, I have no excuse for how I treated you, only an explanation that I was afraid of losing my place in Robert's life. I see now that there was room for both of us to love him, but I was too insecure to believe it. You deserved better from me, and from all of us. I don't ask for forgiveness, only that you know I understand what I did was wrong. I hope you are finding the happiness you always deserved. With sincere regret, Nellie. I folded the letter and set it aside. Maybe someday I would respond to it. Maybe not. But for now, it was enough to know that the truth had finally been acknowledged. As Katharine Hepburn delivered her final monologue on the screen, I pulled my soft throw blanket around my shoulders and smiled. I had spent 68 years learning to disappear, to make myself small enough to fit into other people's lives. Now, finally, I was learning to take up space, to live boldly, to choose joy. Robert's greatest gift hadn't been the money he'd left me. It had been the permission to finally, truly, live for myself, and I intended to make the most of every moment I had left. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.